"I took it off, please," she cried. The rancher froze, and made his move. The fire crackled low in the hearth, throwing flickers of orange across the log cabin walls. The scent of wood smoke lingered heavy in the air, mixing with the faint musk of sweat and earth carried in from the ranch. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and dark, the sound of coyotes calling to the moon. Inside, it was a different kind of wilderness, one of hearts, fear, and choices. She stood trembling, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her chest heaved as she gasped, "I took it off, please." Her voice cracked, breaking like thin ice under weight. The plea was more than words, it was surrender, desperation, maybe even defiance. The rancher froze, his rugged face, lined by years of sun and storms, softened only in his eyes. They flickered as the firelight caught them, as if an entire battle was raging behind their stillness. His hands, calloused and powerful, twitched at his side, unsure if they should reach forward or remain clenched. He wasn't a man used to hesitation, but tonight it had found him. Her eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears. She clutched the fabric tighter, as though she could shield herself with the very thing she had just offered to cast aside. Her words replayed in his mind, each syllable cutting deeper than a blade. "I took it off, please." She was frightened, but not only frightened, she was bearing more than her body. She was bearing her soul. He remembered the storm that had driven her here 2 nights ago. Rain lashing down, lightning splitting the sky, her silhouette stumbling through the mud and shadows until she collapsed at his door. She had been running from something, or someone. He never asked the full truth. Not yet, but the bruises on her arms, the wild fear in her eyes, and the way she jumped at every sound had told him enough. He had given her shelter, a fire, food, and silence. Silence because he knew sometimes words were more dangerous than knives. Now, that silence weighed heavier than iron between them. The woman lowered her hand slightly, trembling, the loose bodice slipping just enough to bare the edge of her collarbone in the fire's glow. It wasn't seduction. It wasn't an invitation. It was raw, broken bargaining. She thought she owed him, that survival came at a price she could not escape. The rancher's jaw tightened. His boots felt like anchors, keeping him rooted, while his instincts warred. He was a man of flesh and blood, but also of scars, inside and out. He knew what it was to be forced, to be used, to be stripped of choice. Memories long buried clawed at him from the shadows. His father's cruelty, his mother's silence, the nights when fists spoke louder than words. He had sworn, long ago, never to become that man. Yet here she stood, begging in fear, mistaking kindness for debt. The fire hissed as a log collapsed into glowing embers. The sound made her flinch, and her fingers tugged her dress tighter, like she was ready for the blow to follow. The rancher took a slow breath, then stepped forward, not with hunger, but with resolve. She stiffened, pressing back against the chair behind her. Her voice came in a whisper, broken as glass, "Please, don't hurt me." His chest constricted, a pain sharper than any wound he'd ever taken. Slowly, he reached up, not to grab her, not to tear the fabric away, but to take her trembling hands in his. His touch was firm, steady, but not demanding. Gently, he lowered her grip, folding the fabric back over her chest, covering her as though it were armor. "You don't owe me anything," he said at last, his voice low, graveled, but steady. Her lips parted, confusion flooding her eyes. For a heartbeat, she didn't believe him. Her entire life had been transactions, chains wrapped in promises. She shook her head. "But, I can't stay here otherwise." "I can't." "You can," he interrupted softly. "Because you're safe here. That's the only bargain." Her breath hitched, and her knees nearly buckled. She clung to his hands like they were the last solid thing in a storm. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unashamed, raw. He didn't wipe them away. He only stood, solid as the stone hearth behind him, letting her see that he would not take, would not demand. The firelight danced on her face, showing a glimmer of something beyond fear, something like hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. She sank into the chair, exhausted from holding herself together for too long. The rancher pulled a blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders with a tenderness that surprised even him. She shivered beneath it, not from cold, but from the weight lifting, the chains she hadn't realized could ever be broken. He stepped back, his shadow stretching long across the cabin floor. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the pop and crackle of the fire. But in that silence, something shifted. The woman closed her eyes, clutching the blanket. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she might not have to sell herself to survive. That maybe, just maybe, a man could look at her without seeing only what she could give. The rancher stood watch by the fire, his hand resting lightly on the mantel, his eyes fixed on the flames. He had faced wild horses, outlaws, storms, and death itself without blinking. But tonight, her plea, her trembling voice, her broken surrender, it had been the hardest battle yet. And he had chosen to fight it the only way that mattered. He hadn't made his move with hunger. He had made it with honor. And that decision would change them both, forever. The fire burned low, the warmth it gave off spilling across the wooden walls, the soft crackle and pop of settling embers filling the silence that hung heavy between them. She sat in the chair with the blanket clutched tight around her shoulders, her face turned slightly toward the glow as though afraid it might be the only light she'd ever know. The rancher stood a few paces away, his shadow long and still on the floorboards, his hands hanging loose at his sides but his chest tight with an ache that felt older than time itself. He had not touched her beyond the simple act of covering her, but that act had shifted something in her heart. She had been ready to trade herself away, not because she wanted to, not because she desired him, but because she had been taught, over and over again, that survival required sacrifice. That men only gave if women paid in flesh. That kindness always came with a hook buried in its softness. And yet here she was, untouched, her body not demanded, her fear not used against her. It was a strange, foreign sort of safety that made her feel like she might break apart more than cruelty ever had. Her lips trembled, and finally, she spoke. You don't understand. They'll come looking for me. They'll know I ran, and if they find me here. The rancher turned his head slowly, his eyes catching hers in the dim light. Let him come. His voice was steady, simple, but beneath it was the weight of iron. Ain't no man setting foot in this house to take what ain't his. Not while I draw breath. Her breath caught. The words weren't loud, weren't shouted, but they carried a certainty that pierced through her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe there was a man who could keep his word without twisting it into a trap. Still, fear clawed at her throat. You don't know what they're capable of, she whispered. You don't know what kind of men they are. The rancher took a step closer, his boots creaking against the wood. He leaned slightly on the mantel, his hand brushing the rough stone, his gaze never leaving her. And you don't know what kind of man I am, he said. Silence stretched. She looked at him, really looked. The firelight deepened the lines of his face, the scars at his jaw, the years of weather and hardship carved into his skin. But it wasn't just the hardness she saw. It was restraint. A man who could have taken her the moment she dropped her dress, who could have claimed her body and silenced her protests, but who instead had frozen, who had chosen to cover her instead of strip her further. A man whose hands could crush or protect, and who had chosen the latter. Her throat tightened. She looked down, her fingers fisting the blanket, the fabric twisting between them. Why? She asked softly. Why are you being kind to me? Men don't. They don't just give without wanting something back. The rancher's jaw flexed. He looked into the flames for a long moment before answering. Because I know what it feels like to be used. To have something taken without your say. And I swore a long time ago, no one under my roof would ever feel that again. Her heart stuttered. There was pain in his voice, a rawness that hinted at ghosts of his own. She wanted to ask, but the fear of breaking whatever fragile truce had been born between them kept her silent. Instead, she sat back in the chair, pulling the blanket higher, the warmth of it seeping into her chilled bones. For the first time since she had run into the storm, her shoulders eased ever so slightly. The minutes ticked by, the fire dimming further until only glowing embers remained. The rancher finally pushed himself from the mantel and walked to the small table by the window. He took a lantern, struck a match, and lit it, the flame casting a softer glow across the room. You'll need rest, he said, his tone gentle but leaving no room for argument. There's a bed in the back. Take it. Her eyes widened. And where will you? I'll take the chair, he cut in. Ain't much sleep needed for me anyhow. She shook her head, her instinct rebelling. No, I can't take your bed. It's not up for debate. His tone was firm now, not unkind but absolute. He nodded toward the doorway to the back room. Go on. For a moment, she hesitated, still afraid to turn her back, still afraid the rules might change once she let herself get too comfortable. But the exhaustion in her bones was stronger than suspicion. She rose slowly, clutching the blanket tight, and walked past him. As she did, she caught the faintest scent of leather, tobacco, and pine on him, a scent not unpleasant, not harsh, but grounding. It lingered in her mind as she stepped into the back room. The bed was simple, the quilt handmade, the mattress firm. She sank onto it, still wrapped in the blanket, still tense as a bowstring. But when she heard the chair creak in the other room, the sound of him settling in instead of following, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sleep did not come easily, but eventually it did come, heavy and dreamless. The rancher stayed awake long into the night, staring at the dying fire. His thoughts churned like restless horses. He hadn't expected this when he opened his door to the storm. He hadn't expected her, or the way she made his chest tighten with something other than lust or pity. He didn't even know her name. But he knew one thing. Whatever demons hunted her, whatever men thought they owned her, they'd have to get through him first. And he'd seen enough violence, done enough himself, to know he wouldn't falter when the time came. When morning light slipped through the curtains, pale and cold, he rose from the chair with a stiffness in his back. He stoked the fire, set water to boil, and fried bread and bacon in a pan. The smell filled the cabin, rich and steadying. She emerged from the back room slowly, blinking against the light, the blanket still around her shoulders. Her hair was loose now, tumbling in waves, making her look younger, softer, though the bruises on her arms told a different story. She froze when she saw him at the stove, the domesticity of it startling her almost as much as his restraint the night before. Sit, he said, nodding toward the table. She obeyed, cautiously, her hands fidgeting in her lap. He set a plate before her, the food steaming. She stared at it, unsure. You don't have to. I know, he interrupted, taking his own seat across from her. Eat anyhow. Her stomach growled at the sight, betraying her. She flushed, but finally, she picked up the fork and tasted the food. It was simple, but after days of fear and running, it might as well have been a feast. She ate slowly at first, then with growing hunger, until the plate was clean. He watched her quietly, not staring, but observing. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. What's your name? She hesitated, as though giving it might cost her something. At last, she whispered, Eliza. Eliza, he repeated, the name fitting strange but solid in his mouth. I'm Jacob. The exchange felt heavier than it should have, like names were weapons or shields. For days that turned into weeks, she stayed. At first, she flinched at every creak of the cabin, every sound outside. But Jacob never pressed her, never demanded, never raised his hand or his voice. Slowly, she began to breathe easier, to sleep deeper. She helped with chores, cooking, tending to small tasks. Her hands remembered the motions, though her heart still carried the weight of fear. And in the quiet of those days, something began to grow between them. Not the desperate bargaining of that first night, not the trembling surrender she had offered, but something quieter, steadier. Trust, fragile as spun glass. Jacob never forgot that night by the fire, her voice breaking as she begged, I took it off, please. He carried those words with him, a reminder of how close she had come to believing herself nothing more than a debt to be collected. And each day he chose, again and again, to prove her wrong. But he also knew the world outside would not stay silent forever. Men like the ones she feared always came. And when they did, his move would not be hesitation. It would be the strike of a man who had sworn to protect what was his. And though she didn't yet know it, though she was still learning what it meant to be safe, Eliza had already become something to him far greater than a frightened runaway. She had become the proof that even broken things could find shelter, and that even hardened men could choose tenderness over hunger. The storm was not yet over. But in the firelit cabin, a different kind of fire had been lit, one that neither of them would let the world extinguish. The days stretched into weeks, and the prairie winter came down sharp and unforgiving. The wind howled across the open land, rattling the shutters, sweeping snow into drifts against the barn and cabin. Jacob worked hard through it all, chopping wood, tending to the cattle, checking the fences that bent under frost. Eliza stayed close to the cabin at first, unsure of the vast loneliness that stretched in every direction. The silence of the land frightened her almost as much as men's footsteps had. But in Jacob's quiet way of living, she began to learn that silence did not always mean danger. Sometimes silence was simply peace. She took to small tasks without being asked, mending shirts with careful stitches, sweeping the floor, cooking stews with the sparse supplies she found in his pantry. She moved like a shadow at first, always cautious, always glancing over her shoulder. But as the days turned, Jacob noticed the stiffness in her shoulders ease, the way her laughter, rare and fragile, began to surface when a stubborn mule made trouble or when he teased her about burning bread. Each sound of it struck him deep, not because it was loud, but because it was alive. Jacob never asked her about the men she feared, not directly. He could see the scars, the bruises, the haunted way she jolted awake some nights from dreams that shook her. She would sit upright in the bed, gasping, clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. On those nights, Jacob would sit in his chair near the fire, speaking low and steady. He told her about the land, about winters worse than this one, about the time he'd been thrown from a horse and broke his arm clean in two. He never told her to calm down, never told her it was just a dream. He spoke until the tremors left her body, until her breathing steadied. She would glance at him, grateful but unsure how to put it into words. He didn't need her to. The more time passed, the more Eliza wondered about him. He was a man of few words, yet everything he did spoke volumes. His silence wasn't the heavy silence of cruelty, it was the patience of a man who knew how to wait, how to carry weight without dropping it on someone else. She often caught him staring out the window across the endless land, his face set, as if remembering something far away. There was sorrow in him, but not the kind that poisoned. It was the kind that steadied. She thought of asking about it, but like him, she learned patience. Then, one morning in late January, when the air was sharp enough to bite the lungs, Jacob spotted tracks near the edge of his land. They weren't his. They weren't Eliza's. Boot tracks. At least 3 men, heavy and deliberate. He crouched in the snow, his eyes narrowing. They hadn't come close to the cabin yet, but they were circling wide, watching, testing. He rose slowly, his jaw tightening. When he returned to the cabin, Eliza was setting bread on the table, her hair tucked back beneath a scarf. She looked up and froze at the expression on his face. He didn't need to say it aloud, but he did anyway. They're here. Her face went white. They're here. Her face went white, the blood draining out of her cheeks. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the chair. No, she whispered, not here. They can't. They haven't found us yet, Jacob said, steady as iron. But they're looking. 3 men, maybe more. They're watching the land. Eliza shook her head violently, panic clawing her throat. Jacob, you don't understand. They'll kill you. They'll try, he said firmly, stepping toward her. His hand brushed her arm, grounding her. Eliza, look at me. Her wide eyes lifted to his, tears already welling. I can't let them hurt you. You don't get to decide that, Jacob said, his voice low but unwavering. This is my land, my home. You're under my roof. No man walks in here and takes what's mine to protect. Her lips trembled. But, no, his word cut clean. Not harsh, not cruel, just absolute. You've been running too long. They ain't the only ones who get to choose what happens next. You chose to run. Now I choose to stand. Eliza's breath came in shuddering bursts. She pressed her hands to her face, torn between fear and disbelief. No one had ever stood for her before. No one had ever made her feel like she was worth fighting for, worth more than the flesh they could strip away. And yet here was this man, with his scars and silence, planting himself like a mountain between her and the storm. That night, Jacob sharpened his rifle and checked the revolver at his hip. He didn't boast, didn't spit fire about what he'd do. He simply prepared, calm and methodical. Eliza watched him from the chair, her heart twisting. Every scrape of the whetstone across steel sounded like a drumbeat of fate. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "You could give me up." Jacob's hand stilled. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to hers. The firelight caught them, hard and unflinching. "Don't say that again." Tears blurred her vision. "If it keeps you alive." "Eliza." His tone sharpened, not in anger but in command. "You're not a thing to hand over. You hear me? You ain't theirs. Not now. Not ever again." Her breath broke, a sob clawing free. She turned her face away, ashamed of the tears, but he set the rifle down and crossed the room in 2 strides. He crouched before her, his hand steady as he lifted her chin. "They took enough from you already. I ain't about to let them take your worth too." For a long, trembling moment, she looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never known before. Not pity, not hunger, not ownership, just truth. The days that followed were restless. Jacob moved like a wolf, checking the land, circling the cabin, watching for signs. Eliza stayed inside, though every creak of the cabin made her flinch. At night, she lay awake in the bed, listening for footsteps outside. Jacob sat in his chair, one hand always near his revolver, his ears tuned to every sound. The fire burned low, steady, as though it too knew what was coming. Then, on the 3rd night, the knock came. It was heavy, deliberate, echoing through the cabin. Eliza froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. Jacob rose from the chair, his hand resting on his gun. He looked at her once, a silent command. "Stay." The knock came again, harder this time. Jacob opened the door slowly, the cold wind rushing in. 3 men stood on the porch, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, their coats heavy with frost. The leader, tall and gaunt, smiled thinly. "Evenin', rancher," the man drawled. "Mighty cold out. Thought we might warm ourselves by your fire." Jacob's face didn't move. "Ain't got room." The man chuckled low. "Oh, I think you do. See, we're looking for someone. A girl, young thing, brown hair, eyes that don't know how to lie. You seen her?" Eliza's breath hitched in the back room. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling. Jacob's eyes were steel. "Ain't seen nobody but the wind and the snow." The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "That's so. Funny thing. We tracked her here. Little feet in the mud, leading right to your door." Jacob shifted, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "Then your eyes lied to you." The man's smile faded. "Now, friend, I don't take kindly to lies. Hand her over, and maybe we let you keep breathing. She ain't yours to hide. She belongs to us." Jacob's jaw flexed. "No, she don't belong to no one." The silence stretched sharp as a blade. The men's eyes narrowed, hands hovering near their belts. Inside, Eliza's knees buckled. She knew what came next. Blood, death. Jacob's voice cut through the night, low and final. "You take one more step on this porch, you'll never take another again." The firelight from inside spilled across the threshold, painting his silhouette against the dark. For the first time, Eliza saw him not just as the man who had covered her with a blanket, not just as the man who sharpened rifles in silence. She saw him as a wall, unyielding, immovable, willing to stand until the earth itself split open beneath him. And in that moment, as fear and hope warred in her chest, she understood that his move had already been made the night she whispered, "I took it off." Please. He had frozen then, choosing restraint over hunger. And now he stood before the storm, choosing defiance over fear. The men outside shifted, their boots crunching against the snow. The leader's eyes gleamed cold, a predator's calculation. Jacob didn't flinch. The standoff stretched, breath visible in the bitter air, the fire crackling behind him, Eliza trembling in the shadows. The first shot was about to break the silence. The night seemed to hold its breath. Snow swirled like ghosts across the dark prairie, catching faint light from the lantern inside the cabin. The 3 men on the porch were motionless, but Jacob could see the twitch in their fingers, the slight shifts of weight in their boots. Men ready to draw. He had faced their kind before. Wolves wearing men's skin, drunk on power, certain the world owed them whatever they wanted. He didn't need to see the scars on Eliza's body to know what they had done. Her fear had said enough. He tightened his grip on the doorframe with one hand, the other resting near the revolver holstered at his hip. He didn't raise it yet. Not until they made the first move. His father's lessons echoed in him. Never pull a gun unless you're ready to kill with it. And never kill unless you got no other choice. The gaunt man at the front tilted his head, his smile gone now, his eyes narrowing. You got a big mouth for a man standing alone. His voice cut sharp, low. Last time I'll ask, hand the girl over, she belongs to us. Behind Jacob, Eliza stood frozen, pressed into the shadows near the back wall of the cabin, her hands clutched around the blanket he'd given her weeks ago. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain they could hear it. She wanted to scream, to beg Jacob to give her up just so he wouldn't die for her. But no sound left her lips. Jacob's reply was quiet, steady. No. That single word snapped the silence in half. The leader's hand dropped to his revolver in a blur. Jacob drew faster. The blast from his Colt split the night, echoing across the empty land. The man jerked backward, the shot tearing through his shoulder, spinning him half around. The two others lunged forward, guns raised, shouting curses. Jacob shoved the door wide and dropped to one knee, firing again. One of the men staggered back as the bullet punched into his thigh, his cry cutting sharp. The third raised his rifle, but Jacob was already moving, rolling to the side of the doorway as the shot ripped into the cabin wall, wood splintering near Eliza's head. She screamed, ducking low, her hands covering her ears. The fire roared in the hearth, throwing frantic shadows as Jacob fired again from cover. The second man dropped his pistol, blood streaking from his arm where Jacob's bullet tore through. The leader, though wounded, snarled like a cornered beast and charged up the steps again, slamming his boot into the cabin door. Jacob rose, grabbed the doorframe with one hand, and drove his shoulder into it, slamming the door shut hard enough to rattle the hinges. The man outside cursed, pounding on it, then fired blindly through the wood. Bullets tore through, one splinter grazing Jacob's cheek, another burying itself in the stone hearth. Eliza's breath came in sobs. She pressed herself flat to the floor, eyes wide as the night exploded around her. She thought Jacob would fall. She thought the door would break. But he was unmovable. Jacob waited, patient even in the chaos. He knew men like this, reckless, sloppy once their blood was up. He counted the shots. When the gun clicked empty, Jacob flung the door open and fired. The leader fell back, clutching his chest, gasping as blood bloomed across his coat. The two others scrambled, one dragging the other who bled from the thigh. They staggered into the snow, their curses growing faint as they fled into the dark. Only the wounded leader lay near the porch steps, gasping, eyes wide with rage and disbelief. Jacob stepped out into the cold, his boots crunching in the snow. He leveled the revolver at the man's head. The leader's lips curled back, his teeth red with blood. "She's ours," he rasped. "You can't keep her. More'll come." Jacob's eyes narrowed, his breath a slow, misting cloud in the freezing air. "Not while I'm still standing." His finger tightened. Eliza's voice broke the night. "Jacob." He froze, his arms steady, the man groaning at his feet. Behind him, Eliza stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. She clutched the doorframe, shaking her head violently. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, don't." For the first time, Jacob faltered. His eyes flicked from her to the dying man. Every instinct screamed to finish it, to cut the snake's head clean off before it struck again. But her voice anchored him, trembling and raw. She had seen enough death, enough cruelty. If she begged him not to, it wasn't out of pity for the man. It was because she couldn't bear to see Jacob step into that same darkness. His chest rose and fell, the cold air burning his lungs. At last, with a grunt, he lowered the gun. The leader's head fell back in the snow, his breath rattling, slowing. He wouldn't live long. Jacob holstered the revolver and turned back to Eliza, his eyes searching hers. She was shaking, but relief washed across her face like a breaking wave. Inside, Jacob barred the door, reloaded, and checked the windows. Eliza sat in the chair, her hands trembling as she tried to breathe. Her voice broke the silence. "They'll come back." He was right. Jacob stood by the fire, his face hard in the glow. "Then we'll be ready." Her tears spilled fast now. "You'll die, Jacob. You'll die because of me." He turned, his eyes locking with hers, and for the first time his voice rose, sharp and fierce. "Stop saying that. You hear me? Stop. You didn't bring this on yourself. They did. and I'll be damned if I let them win." She sobbed into her hands, shaking. He crossed the room and crouched beside her, his rough hand resting gently on her arm. "Eliza," he said softly now, "listen to me. That night, when you stood right here and begged me, when you thought you had to give yourself away, I made my choice. I chose not to take, and I'll keep choosing the same way. To protect, to fight, not because you owe me, but because no one should ever make you beg like that again." Her breath caught, her tears slowing as his words sank in. She stared at him, her heart aching with something she didn't know how to name. Gratitude, yes, but more, something she hadn't dared to feel in years. The hours passed, long and heavy. Jacob sat watch at the window, rifle across his lap. Eliza dozed fitfully in the chair, waking at every sound of the wind. Neither truly slept. By dawn, the storm had passed. Jacob stepped outside into the pale light, his boots crunching over blood-stained snow. The leader was gone, dragged away, likely by the other two in the night. Tracks led east, back toward town, back toward whatever nest of vipers they crawled from. He stared at the horizon, his jaw tight. They'd return, in greater numbers, and when they did, it wouldn't just be 3 men testing his door. It would be a pack. When he stepped back inside, Eliza was waiting, her face pale but set. "We have to leave," she said firmly. "No," Jacob said. "This is my land, my home. They'll burn it," she whispered. "They'll burn it down around you just to see me crawl." He looked at her long, hard. "You trust me, Eliza?" Her lips parted. The word stuck in her throat, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." "Then trust this," he said. "I ain't leaving, and I ain't letting them take you. They want a war, they'll find one here." Her eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was something steadier, fiercer. She saw the truth in him, that he'd rather die standing than live on his knees. And for the first time, she let herself believe she was worth that. The days that followed were tense with preparation. Jacob reinforced the doors, boarded the windows, stacked wood near the hearth. He taught Eliza how to load the rifle, how to fire it steady, how to breathe through fear. Her hands shook at first, but he stood behind her, guiding her grip, his breath steady near her ear. "You don't need to be fast," he told her. "You just need to be sure." At night, when she lay awake listening to the crackle of the fire, she thought of the first night she had stood before him, dress clutched in her fists, begging him not to hurt her. And now, weeks later, she stood beside him, learning to fight, learning to believe that maybe, just maybe, her body was hers, her life was hers, and no man would ever take it from her again. But the storm was still gathering on the horizon. Jacob knew it, Eliza felt it, and when it broke, it would test everything they had built in the fragile safety of that firelit cabin. The prairie held its breath once more, waiting for the clash that would decide if the past claimed Eliza back, or if Jacob's defiance could carve a new future from the ruins of hers. The days that followed passed in a strange stillness, as though the world itself held its breath. Eliza moved about the cabin with a quiet determination, helping Jacob patch the roof, carry wood, and ready the supplies as though every moment might be their last. She had never known work like this. Her past life had been one of captivity, of orders barked and duties forced. Here, though she was weary to the bone, she felt something she had never felt before: choice. Each log of wood stacked, each rifle cartridge prepared, each stitch of fabric mended was something she did not because she was told but because she wanted to, because she chose to stand with Jacob. And that made her stronger. Jacob watched her from the shadows of his hat brim, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of pride and worry. He saw the tremor in her hands as she loaded shells, saw the way she sometimes froze when the wind outside caught the shutters, and he knew the fear was always there. But he also saw the steel slowly forming beneath it, like a blade being forged from fire and hammer blows. On the fourth morning, the stillness broke. Jacob was standing at the edge of the porch, rifle cradled in his arms, when he saw movement on the horizon. Dark specks against the pale snow, growing larger as they drew closer. He counted 6 horses, maybe 7. Each rider carried the kind of stillness that came from knowing they rode with intent. Jacob's jaw tightened. He turned back inside, shutting the door firmly. Eliza looked up from the hearth, her face paling when she saw his eyes. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. She knew. They're coming, Jacob said quietly. 6 of them, maybe more straggling behind. Her breath caught, but she steadied herself. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and reached for the rifle resting by the wall. Jacob raised a hand to stop her. No, not unless I say. You hear me? They'll want to scare you, rattle you into making a mistake. You keep yourself low, keep yourself steady. She looked at him, her lips trembling. What if you? She couldn't finish. The thought of him falling, of those men tearing him from her, was too much. Jacob stepped close, tilting her chin so her eyes met his. His gaze was unshakable, calm, like the earth beneath her feet. Then you finish what I start. You don't let them touch you. Ever again. She swallowed hard, then nodded. Her fingers tightened on the rifle stock. Moments later, the riders drew close. Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, broad shoulders squared. The leader rode at the front, a heavy-set man with a scar across his cheek and a wide-brimmed black hat. His eyes were cold, calculating. Behind him rode the 2 survivors from the earlier fight, one limping, the other with his arm in a sling. Their faces twisted with hatred when they saw Jacob. Well, the leader called out, reining in his horse a few yards from the porch. His voice carried, smooth and oily. So you're the one who thinks he can keep what don't belong to him. Jacob's voice was low but steady. She belongs to no one but herself. A murmur ran through the men behind the leader, some chuckling, others sneering. The leader tilted his head, smiling without warmth. That's a fine way to dress up theft. That girl was ours. We fed her, clothed her, gave her work. Jacob's eyes burned. You chained her, you broke her, and you think that counts for claiming? The man's smile vanished. Don't matter what you think, farmer. You're standing in the way of something bigger than yourself. You hand her over now, and maybe we let you live long enough to see another sunrise. Jacob raised his rifle, slow and deliberate, until its barrel leveled at the leader's chest. His voice cut sharp. Step 1 foot closer, and you'll never see another sunset. The tension snapped taut like a drawn bowstring. Snowflakes drifted in the silence, the horses shifting restlessly beneath their riders. Then, with a sharp bark, the leader shouted, "Take him." The world erupted. Gunfire split the air, echoing across the prairie. Jacob dropped low, firing from the porch. One rider toppled from his horse with a scream, the snow blooming red beneath him. Another shot grazed Jacob's arm, the sting hot, but he didn't falter. He fired again, and another man reeled back, clutching his gut. Inside the cabin, Eliza crouched near the window, heart hammering. She pressed herself flat, just as Jacob had told her, fighting the terror rising like a tide. Through the crack in the shutters, she saw men dismounting, advancing with pistols raised. Her hands shook around the rifle, but she held steady. Jacob fought like a man possessed, each shot deliberate, each movement economical. But there were too many. A bullet tore into the porch post inches from his head, another struck his thigh, sending fire lancing up his leg. He stumbled, teeth gritted, but stayed standing. The leader laughed, his voice carrying above the chaos. You can't hold us all off, boy. Lay down that gun, and we'll make it quick. Jacob spat blood into the snow, his eyes burning. I ain't laying down nothing. As the men closed in, one broke toward the cabin door. Eliza's eyes widened. Without thinking, she raised the rifle, aimed through the crack in the shutter, and fired. The shot cracked loud in her ears, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. Outside, the man jerked and fell face first into the snow, unmoving. The recoil knocked her breath away, but she steadied herself, reloading as Jacob had taught her. Her fear still clawed at her, but something else rose higher now, fury. These men had stolen everything from her once. They would not do it again. Jacob glanced back through the window and saw her, saw the fire in her eyes as she chambered another round. Pride surged in him even as pain burned through his body. She wasn't broken anymore. She was fighting. The gunfight raged on. Men shouted, horses screamed, bullets tore splinters from the cabin walls. Jacob dropped another man, but his strength was fading. Blood soaked his thigh, each movement slower, heavier. Still, he fought on, his will unbending. At last, only 3 men remained, the leader and the 2 Jacob had wounded before. The leader dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow as he strode forward, revolver in hand. His face twisted in a snarl. Enough games. I'll finish this myself. Jacob tried to raise his rifle, but his wounded leg buckled. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard. The leader loomed over him, gun aimed at his head. Should have handed her over, the man sneered. Would have saved you a world of hurt. Before Jacob could move, the cabin door burst open. Eliza stood framed in the doorway, her hands gripping the rifle, her face pale but resolute. Leave him, she cried, her voice fierce, carrying across the snow. The leader turned, laughing. You think you can? Her shot cut him off. The bullet slammed into his chest, knocking him backward. He staggered, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed into the snow, unmoving. Silence fell. The 2 remaining men stared, fear and rage warring in their eyes. But when Jacob, bleeding and battered, raised his revolver with grim determination, they broke. They turned and fled, scrambling onto their horses and vanishing into the horizon. The prairie was quiet again, save for Jacob's ragged breathing and the crackle of the cabin fire behind them. Eliza dropped the rifle, running to him, her hands catching his shoulders as he swayed. Jacob, she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. He managed a weak smile, though blood streaked his face. Told you, we'd be ready. She shook her head, sobbing. Don't you leave me now. Don't you dare. He pressed a hand over hers, his grip weak but steady. Ain't plannin' on it. With effort, she dragged him back into the cabin, laying him near the fire. She tore strips from her dress, binding his wounds as best she could, her tears falling onto his skin. All the while, he kept his eyes on her, as though she were the only thing tethering him to this world. Hours passed. His fever rose, but he held on, murmuring her name when the pain grew sharp. She stayed beside him, never leaving, whispering to him, begging him to fight. And he did. By morning, his breathing had steadied. His eyes opened, weak but alive. Relief flooded her, and she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. His hand, rough and bloody, lifted to stroke her hair. Eliza, he whispered, you saved me. She pulled back, her tear-streaked face meeting his. No, Jacob, you saved me. You gave me back my life. And now, I'm not afraid anymore. For the first time in years, she felt free. Not because the men were dead, not because the danger was gone, but because she had stood against it. Because together, they had fought and survived. Jacob smiled faintly, his eyes closing. Then it was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Jacob slowly healed. The scars remained, but his strength returned. Eliza never left his side. Together, they rebuilt what had been broken, not just the cabin walls or the blood-stained ground, but themselves. The prairie stretched endless around them, harsh and untamed. But in that little cabin, with the fire crackling and their hands clasped, there was a new beginning. A place where no man owned her, where no past defined him, where choice and freedom grew like the first green shoots after winter. And though danger might come again, they would face it together. Not as master and captive, not as broken and protector, but as equals. As 2 souls who had chosen, against every shadow and every scar, to fight for each other. The wind howled across the open land, carrying away the echoes of gunfire, carrying away the ghosts of the past. What remained was simple, and powerful, and enough. They had won, and for the first time in a long, brutal life, Eliza believed in tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.